Unfriendly competition is one of my favourite quests in Oblivion. It's a really fun little quest about a merchant who's getting items to sell at suspiciously low prices. The other merchants hire you to solve the mystery of what's enabling him to do this, and by the end of a little escapade you gain a trio of unique items to use on your future adventures. So far, so good, but the problem comes when we take a look at how these items change depending on what level you are when you undertake this mission. The ring you get as your quest reward, the Weatherward Circlet, has a resist fire and resist frost effect. If you do this quest before you hit level 5, then it only gives 10% resistances, but if you wait until you're level 25, then you instead get 35% resistance from this ring. The same problem occurs with Debaser, a sword you can pick up during this mission. Go in at level 1 and the sword has these stats. Go in at level 25 and it's these instead. Not only is the enchantment getting significantly stronger, but so too are the base stats of the weapon. And what about the third unique item you can pick up? Caliban's Grim Retort is an elven mace with some pretty decent enchantments on it when you pick it up at level 1. And what about if you pick it up after level 25? Well then, it looks like this. That's right, nothing's changed. The weapon remains the same no matter what level you pick it up at, and you get it at the exact same time and place as Debaser. This means that if you do this mission early on, then you end up with a pretty terrible unique sword, but a mace which is going to be crazy strong right now. But if you wait till a higher level, then the sword will be better, but the mace will have started to fall behind, dealing significantly less damage than any other leveled items you'll be picking up. This means that you're always receiving your rewards in some sort of suboptimal grouping. If you get the mace at an optimal time, then the sword and ring suffer for it. If you get those two at their strongest variants, then the mace you pick up will be practically worthless. Unique items are supposed to be unique. They shouldn't be changing what they are depending on how strong the player character might be when they pick them up. But this isn't just a problem when it comes to unique items. The level loot issue can get even worse when just looking at standard gear. For this example, I want to take a look at Fallout 76. The weapons in this game come at a range of different levels, mostly at increments of 5 or 10. If we take a look at the hunting rifle, then we can see that the level 1 version of this weapon deals about half the damage of a level 50 version. But beyond that, they're basically just the same weapon. Nothing else is really changing, other than just the damage numbers associated with it. If you pick up a hunting rifle early on, and want to stick with it as your main weapon, then you're going to be punished for that. You'll have to keep finding or crafting higher level hunting rifles until you reach level 50, and can finally end up with a weapon you can stick with. The big problem that this creates within Fallout 76 is that the game doesn't really start proper until you reach level 50. Every cool weapon or legendary piece of armor you pick up before that point will just be objectively weaker than it should be. Doesn't matter if you got the perfect legendary drop for your build 20 levels ago. That weapon is severely underpowered now, and has to be got rid of. All this does is create an unavoidable grind that all players have to partake in if they want to keep playing the game. I don't see any actual benefit from having leveled items like this, on either the player side or the developer side. It's more work for them, and more work for us, without anything substantial changing at the end of it all. But this isn't the only issue that comes about from leveling up in RPGs. In fact, the problems I have with leveled loot isn't what prompted me to make this video. No, instead what prompted me were leveled enemies. These really come in two different forms. We have variants and new enemy types. Some games will spawn in different variants of a familiar enemy based on how high a level the player character is. Think of Draugr from Skyrim or ghouls from Fallout. While each of these have a basic version, you will encounter stronger variants as you level up more. At the start of Skyrim, you'll only be dealing with standard Draugr and Draugr thralls, but once you reach level 20 or so, you'll mostly encounter Draugr wights and scourges. These are really just the same enemy as the basic Draugr you were fighting at the start of the game, but with a much larger health pool. The other level-dependent enemies I mentioned were new enemy types, and for this I think Oblivion gives the best examples. When you first start exploring Cyrodiil, you'll likely encounter trolls up in the mountains, but once you've leveled up enough times, those trolls are replaced with minotaurs. These are much stronger enemies, and the jump up in difficulty between the two is substantial. This sort of thing also happens with the Oblivion gates. Early on, these will be filled with low-level Daedra, like scams. Nothing for even new players to really have to worry about. But reach a high enough level, and suddenly you're dealing with deadly spider Daedra, who can take a real beating and significantly slow down your progress. I want to make it clear at this point that I'm not complaining about the mere existence of stronger enemies. I believe that stronger enemies should appear later in the game. My problem is with the determining factor being the player level, rather than actual progression through the game. The reason that I think this can be such a problem is because of over and under leveling. When enemies are based on your character's level, then those players who have spent a lot of time with the game and leveled lots of skills are being punished for it, whereas those who are ignoring the majority of the game's content have a much easier time. This problem becomes notably worse in any RPG where you have skills to level up which aren't directly related to your combat performance. In many Bethesda RPGs, this creates the issue where, if the player levels a non-combat skill too high, then they end up dealing with much stronger enemies, without having the capabilities to deal with them effectively. All that time spent training speechcraft now means that you're dealing with minotaurs and ogres while your blade skill is still relatively low. On the other hand, in RPGs where enemies and loot aren't determined by the character level, but instead are focused on game progression of some kind, you have the option to overlevel your characters, spending extra time farming XP in order to become stronger and have an easier time with the game. This extra time you put in makes the experience easier than it would be for a low-level player. But in Bethesda RPGs, the opposite can end up happening. For example, here is some footage I recorded for an old video of mine where I went over every perk in Fallout 4 and talked about how they could be improved. For that video, I made a character who was high enough level to select all the perks, so that I could more easily capture footage of them in action. But this led to the problem that the enemies I faced were nigh on unkillable at times. This may be an extreme example, as realistically most people won't be playing Fallout 4 with a character that's got hundreds of levels, but it still showcases that leveled loot isn't the sole issue here. If you remove leveled loot, then you get the Fallout 4 issue where enemies leveled indefinitely, so weapons are actually getting weaker as you progress due to the scaling factor of enemies' health and resistances. But even if Fallout 4 did have leveled loot in the same way that 76 does, there will typically still be the problem of a level cap for that loot. We see this inside of 76, where level 45 or 50 is the top tier of what you get item-wise. Making different levels of the same weapons is already extra unnecessary work for the developers as far as I'm concerned. But the more levels they have to add, the more work that's being put into a system that's just making games worse. It feels like both of these systems are trying to compensate for one another. You need leveled loot so that weapons you wield are strong enough to tackle the stronger enemies that start spawning in at higher levels, but the only reason those higher level enemies need to spawn in is so that your higher level weapons aren't one-shotting everything and making the game too easy. The two systems are just creating problems for the other to solve. But if both were removed, then we wouldn't have these problems to start with. Individually, they're both creating their own issues, but together, they make the worst thing of all: stagnation. The problem is that characters don't get to feel stronger by leveling up. The world just becomes harder at roughly the same rate, meaning the challenge tends to be linear. Getting more levels under your belt doesn't make you any stronger compared to the world around you. Increasing in level should be a sign that you've become stronger. The practice you've put in should be represented by you becoming a more powerful warrior or more competent mage. You should be able to now take on harder foes who were previously out of your reach, and easily dispatch the enemies who used to be on equal footing to you. What shouldn't happen is that you go back to a location you struggled with earlier, only to now find that the enemies are 5 times stronger than they were before, and all your gains amounted to nothing. I think the best way for me to showcase why this is a problem is to stop focusing on the games where it is an issue, and instead highlight a couple of games which don't have such a focus on items and enemies being determined by the player's level. The games I'll talk about in this section will be Fallout New Vegas and Dark Souls. Two fairly different RPGs, but there are ways they do things which are much better than revolving everything around player character level. Sadly, New Vegas does technically have leveled enemy variants, though it doesn't lean in quite as heavily to this as the Bethesda Fallout games do. There's also no weapon leveling. If you pick up a 10mm pistol at level 1 and find a different 10mm at level 30, then they're going to have the same stats. It's just a pistol. It's not magically been assembled in some different way because you didn't see it until you'd leveled up a bunch. Weapons being exactly what they are every time means that you don't rely on the player switching out their loadout every time they level up, but instead can put the weaker weapons in easy to find areas, and the stronger weapons in more challenging locations. One of the best examples of this is Deadwind Cavern. This is one of the most dangerous locations in the game, being a cave filled with Deathclaws, one of the strongest enemies in the wasteland. But if you decide you want to conquer this location, and manage to get past all these creatures, then your reward is Mercy, a unique grenade machine gun, and one of the most powerful weapons in the game. With no leveling nonsense going on, you can put one of the strongest weapons behind a group of the strongest enemies. Someone who is really good at the game may be able to pick this up while still relatively low level, but a newer player or someone who hasn't mastered the game will have to wait and come back when they're stronger, once they've leveled up more and gained perks to make them a better combatant. Imagine this same scenario, but if New Vegas had the same sort of leveled loot that Fallout 76 does. A player who reaches max level takes on Deadwind Cavern and has a fairly easy time with it, as they're already as strong as can be. They then get themselves a max level Mercy, which is incredibly powerful. But what about the player who shows up early to this area and is able to get through it nonetheless? Maybe they're only level 20, but they're really good at stealth, so are able to sneak past and steal Mercy without engaging the Deathclaws. Or perhaps they're a really talented and patient sniper, who slowly whittles down their numbers at a distance before moving in close. Either way, this player showed great skill and determination, and as their reward, they get a level 20 version of Mercy, which deals half the damage of what the level 50 version would have. This player had a much more difficult time than the level 51, but the harder challenge presented them with a worse reward. You want the strongest weapons to be tucked away behind the strongest enemies, and New Vegas is able to do this by not scaling everything to the player. But I think for the best example, we should take a look at Dark Souls. One of the first locations you will reach in the original Dark Souls is Firelink Shrine. From here there are potentially a few paths you can take, but most new players will focus on the two obvious ones. You either head up, past the Hollows and Undead Soldiers, in order to reach the Undead Burg, or you head down, through the graveyard filled with skeletons and then towards the catacombs. The way you're supposed to head is to the Undead Burg, and the method the game does of guiding you this way is pretty simple. Hollows are weaker than skeletons. Sure, you can technically defeat the skeletons in the graveyard, but they're incredibly challenging early on. The Hollows on the other hand will go down in a few hits, even with starting weapons and no levels under your belt. It is Dark Souls, so they still can kill you, but it's a clear indicator of a path forward, and once you've made a fair bit of progress, leveling up and upgrading your weapons, you can head back to the graveyard and feel the satisfaction of now being able to take down all those skeletons. Where before they were incredibly challenging foes who took multiple minutes of fighting to destroy, now they have become just basic enemies who you can dispatch in a matter of seconds. This sense of progression and feeling of becoming stronger is something that RPGs can do better than any other form of game, but only if you don't level scale everything. But don't let Dark Souls be the only example of this, because New Vegas does the exact same thing. At the start of the game you'll need to leave Goodsprings and try to make your way to the Strip. There are a few different ways to reach this location, but one of the ways you're directed on where to go is by the super tough enemies being to the north, and the weaker enemies being to the south. Try and push north towards the Strip directly, and you'll have to tackle Deathclaws, Cazadors, and other horrors which you aren't equipped for. But head south and it's geckos and ghouls, much easier for a courier with a varmint rifle. Ultimately, what this all really comes down to is good and bad game design. Level scaling reeks to me of bad game design, of not knowing how to balance the game properly for the player, and deciding to just scale everything to them, in the hopes that the game will then just balance itself out. But good game design involves carefully crafting locations with specific enemies, and items that relate to the challenge of those enemies, of letting players who are up for the challenge show up to higher level areas while underleveled themselves, and giving the opportunity for anyone who is struggling to grind out some levels so that they can have an easier time with the next section. Hopefully all of that helps to explain why I hate level scaling. Feel free to share your own thoughts on the subject down in the comments below, leave a like on the video if you share my feelings on this topic, and feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more RPG focused videos. I do really enjoy making these sorts of videos, even though they typically take a really long time to make, so the more support I see for this sort of content, the more of it I can make in the future. A big thank you to all my patrons and channel members who go above and beyond to support the channel. And as always, thank you for watching. Sarge out.